There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. Hey, just a quick one before we start. If you've ever enjoyed this podcast, we'd love if you could stop for a moment and hit the follow button on your app. By subscribing, you're helping our show to grow, which means we can approach even bigger guests, both in Australia and overseas, and bring the very best in true crime to your ears each week. It's 4:30pm on a Monday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas 2022, and four young police officers are walking side by side down a gravel driveway on a remote property a few hours west of Brisbane. They've been asked to do a missing persons check by their colleagues across the border in New South Wales, a routine police job. Parking their two Land Cruisers at the gates of the Weambilla address, they've already alerted the occupants of their arrival, waving at the security camera and honking their horns before hopping over the fence and heading in on foot towards the weatherboard house that is just out of sight around the bend. 3 gunshots crack through the still country air. What happens next has Australia holding their breath as a 6-hour police siege unfolds in the remote country location. By the end, 6 people are dead, and the crime is declared by authorities as Australia's first Christian terror attack. The horror of the initial shooting is only the start. In the weeks and months to follow, a tale of conspiracy theories, religious extremism, and ambush starts to unravel. A horrifying crime that has left a deep scar in not just Queensland, but the entire nation. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. On December 12, 2022, Constables Rachel McCrow and Matthew Arnold were killed in the line of duty. They were 29 and 26 years old. Their colleagues, also in their 20s, Keely Bruff and Randall Kirk, narrowly escaped with their lives. Their murders shattered not just their families, but their colleagues. Queensland Commissioner Katarina Carroll struggled to hold back her emotion as she addressed the media.
Losing one of our own has a profound impact on every single officer and their families. To lose 2 officers in one incident is absolutely devastating.
A neighbour, Alan Dare, also died that day, as did the 3 people who were firing at them, Gareth and Stacey Train, and his brother Nathaniel. The Weambilla shooting was the deadliest day in Queensland Police history. The details of it so horrifying, they sound like a Hollywood action movie. A tale of ambush, of being hunted through the bush, of being executed at point-blank range. What officers Rachel, Matthew, Randall and Keely endured that afternoon had them hailed heroes by the force. Alan was also hailed that way, but as you'll soon hear, that's not a title his wife feels comfortable with. The 3 people responsible for murdering them, 2 of whom were school principals, all of them conspiracy theorists, won't have their day in court. They were shot dead by police 6 hours into the siege. But there are still many unanswered questions from that night, which will be examined when an inquest gets underway at the end of this month. 9 News presenter Melissa Downs covered this story as it unfolded in 2022 and has been revisiting the case in a new podcast called The Ultimate Sacrifice. To take us back to the start, Melissa joins us now. Melissa, on December 12, 2022, you were preparing to present the 6pm Queensland Bulletin, as you usually do, and news reports started filtering in of a shooting. Can you remember what was going through your head in that moment?
It was one of those times where, you know, your rundown is kind of set, especially as you get closer to 6 o'clock. So it was around, as you say, 5:30, even 5:45 when we just got these reports coming through. There's been a shooting incident out west, 3 hours west of Brisbane. So, I mean, it's so far away, you're not going to get to it straight away. And 3 officers unaccounted for, and that was kind of all we had to begin with. And then as the hour of that bulletin unfolded, more details were coming through. Officer injured, officer down. There's like an electric feeling in the newsroom that just spreads, and people know this is a big story. Even the having to get out to Weambilla, which is 3.5 hours west of Brisbane, this tiny town that most of us had never even heard of, didn't even really know how to pronounce the name. And actually, as well as that feeling within the newsroom of, okay, how do we cover this within the bulletin? That idea of how are we covering this for the next 24 hours, days, weeks. So immediately one of our reporters, Alex Heinke, who had already been set up to do a cross into the news on a completely different story, he got the call at 10 to 6. Alex, get in the car, head west. We don't know what's going on, but you need to go. So he and his cameraman just packed up all their gear and off they went, not really knowing even where they were going. But what happened in those next 5 hours was just one of the wildest stories you've ever heard. And then what came out after that as well, the twists and turns of the people involved, it was just remarkable.
So this is one of those stories that has stayed with you?
Yes, there are stories that do stay with you. And I think this is one because it just kept going. It wasn't just what happened on that Monday or the Tuesday or the Wednesday. I mean, here we are nearly 2 years later, and we're still, when the coronial inquest starts, we're going to be finding out so much more about what happened. And it was because of the shocking nature of it. These 4 young country coppers, young constables, walking into this property just for a welfare check. So a really routine call out, nothing out of the ordinary, not expecting anything. And I've been out to the property. I've seen the driveway where they would have parked, got out of the car, started walking down this driveway, birds, twittering in the trees, wind whistling through the leaves, having a laugh. 2 weeks before Christmas, Matthew Arnold, who was one of the officers who lost his life, he only had one more shift out west and then he was heading into Brisbane to work with child protection. So there would have been all that talk about him leaving, heading back to Brisbane, that exciting new chapter of his life. And then out of nowhere, bam, they were ambushed, bullets flying through. Matthew and Rachel were hit. Matthew died nearly instantly. Rachel, we know, didn't die instantly. Randall Kirk, he was hit in the leg, was able to get into the bushes, get into a car and get back to the main road. Keely Bruff, who was the 4th constable, she took off in the other direction into the scrub. And so in those moments directly after that, Rachel was lying on her back. She was still alive. And we know this because she had the presence of mind to switch on her body cam. And it captured a man walking towards her, head-to-toe camouflage. This was told to Alex Heinke, our reporter, by police in the days following. They had seen that vision from her body cam, one of them breaking down crying when he recounted that vision that showed, looking up into the sky, she was on her back, someone walking over in camouflage, her saying, "No, no, please, I've got a family." He bent down, took her gun out of her holster and said, "I've got family too," and shot her. And we don't know whether the other officers turned their body cams on. What did they capture of that escape? So Randall was able to get out. Then Keely was running through the bush, hiding in the bush. And the trains then set fire to the scrub because they were trying to flush her out and kill her. They were hunting her and they were calling out to her. And she rang 000. She was on the phone to 000, giving them information about what was going on. She also texted her family to say, "I don't think I'm going to make it out." And here was a girl who had only graduated from the police academy 8 weeks earlier.
Well, they were all 4 of them fairly fresh in the police force, weren't they?
They were, I think 2.5 years was the longest. I think that was Matthew. He'd been in for 2.5 years. So yes, Rachel, I think, was 1.5 years. They were all young constables, and that's often what happens in Queensland. I'm not sure in other states, but often when people graduate from the police academy, they get sent out to the country, earn their stripes, do their time, learn policing in that environment. And so he was Keely with 8 weeks experience put into a situation that is, you can't even really comprehend it. And so she just stayed low, was talking on the phone to 000 and was able to get out. I mean, mind you, when she's there in the bush, we all know what Australian scrub is like. There were brown snakes. I'm sure there would have been spiders. I mean, it would have been terrifying.
It would have been getting dark as well.
Yeah, it would have been getting dark. I mean, it was summer, so sun setting a little bit later, but definitely towards dusk. So that part of the story then leads into another really incredible part that we don't know that much about, but we will find out in the inquest. There were 16 other country coppers who, once the word got out that this had gone down, they galvanised, again with limited resources. They were able to rescue Keely, they got Randall, and they went into the property, not really knowing what they were facing, knowing that obviously someone was shooting and trying to kill them. And they went in and they got the bodies of Matthew and Rachel and brought them out. And that was just 16 country coppers. We haven't really heard their story. But what we have heard is the police commissioner talking about the bravery, and the police union president, Ian Levers, talking about the bravery that those officers showed without knowing really what they were facing, to go back in to save their colleagues. Because I guess at that point as well, they didn't really know whether Rachel and Matthew were alive or dead. So in their minds, they were going in there to save their colleagues.
He used to come out of his shed around the corner there and just do something, and he'd give me a kiss and he'd go back to his shed. And I said to him, you don't have to do that all the time, you know. And he said, I do it because I want to. I said, okay then, but that day, he didn't come and kiss me goodbye. He just waved and said, I'll be back.
There's another victim that we're yet to touch on because, as you've mentioned, Rachel and Matthew died that afternoon. Another man died. His name was Alan. Who was he and how did he get caught up in this?
So Alan Dare was the innocent neighbour that people might remember being talked about. He and his wife Kerry lived on the other side of Waynes Road, which is the road in Weambilla where the properties are. Now, they're all big properties. They're about 100 acres, big properties. So if you go down Waynes Road, you don't see any homes. They're set well back. They had seen the trains once or twice, didn't really know them well. And it was a Monday afternoon like normal. Kerry would always have a swim in the afternoon. 4:30 she would get out. Alan was there. He was about to prepare dinner and they heard gunshots. Now, I guess in that area of the world, you do hear gunshots, but they then heard semi-automatic gunfire. And that's illegal in Queensland, in Australia. So Alan said to Kerry, what's that about? You know, and she said, well, close to Christmas, maybe someone's got a new toy. Do you really think you want to go and ask them what are they doing with it? And he said no. But then, I think it was maybe an hour later, they heard an explosion and they saw smoke. And in that region, if a bushfire starts, it can travel quickly. So if you see something, a bushfire, whatever it is, you go and investigate because it may not be affecting your property right now, but it very well could soon. So Alan rang his neighbour Vic. The two of them went to investigate. They pulled up outside the train's property and there was a car on fire. That was the police car, which I don't think they recognised as a police car at the time. It was so engulfed in the flames. And as they were there talking, just trying to assess the situation, Vic has told us, and Kerry as well, of what Vic had told her, that Alan looked down the driveway and said, you know, I think there's someone down there. And at that moment, 2 bullets rang out. Now, one hit Alan, one came very close to hitting Vic. He dropped to the ground. He commando crawled to see Alan. Alan had actually had his phone out and was filming. So Vic grabbed the phone. He did a quick check of Alan and he could see there was blood in his back. So he knew he'd been hit. And he then crawled out, found his way back to his quad bike and got back to Kerry and said, Al's in a bad way. We need to get out of here. Now, that will come into question at the inquest because Kerry, one of her biggest questions about what happened on that day is when Alan and Vic went to investigate, that was at least an hour, if not more, after the initial shots were fired. Why weren't they warned? Why wasn't the community And Kerry claims that she was on the phone with 000. When Alan went to investigate, she got onto 000 and said, "We think something's going on there." And she says she wasn't warned about what went on. And she's really angry. She and Alan, they'd been married just shy of 26 years. I think their anniversary was 2 or 3 days after he was killed. They'd been in Weambilla for 3 years. They'd just moved out there. That was their retirement. It was their dream home. They'd built what was their dream home and they were living their life. And to have all of that snatched away from her, she's angry and she wants answers.
Well, that's not the only thing she's angry about. In your interviews with her, she shares a lot of different areas that she's angry at, one in particular being that her husband's body wasn't recovered alongside those police officers.
Yeah, look, it's one of those things. Police may say they have protocols, but for Kerry to be out on that dirt road at the command centre where all the other police were, as we've said, they were able to get Matthew and Rachel out, and rightly so. But Alan's body was left there on the dirt road for 13 hours, covered by a tarp, and it wasn't until daybreak that she was there, looked down the road, saw the tarp on the road and realised that was Alan. And our reporter, Alex Heinke, was with her at that moment. And to hear him and to hear Kerry describe that moment that she realised it was him, you know, she says, and I've heard it before when people are in that most extreme state of shock, it's like their brain gets split in two. You know, their mouth doesn't work properly. She says her legs weren't working properly. You know, it just all explodes in their brain. And Alex being there, seeing that, I think this is also an interesting part often of all these stories as well is, you know, for reporters who are there, how do you tell that story? It's so difficult to do. And also here, again, we are years down the track. And when we interviewed Alex, I mean, he was close to tears recounting that and recounting his further conversations with Kerry, because you become friends with people in their darkest moments and their heartbreak, you feel it.
And I guess you don't want to take away from the heroes, the police officers that put their lives on the line to save their friends, the Rachel, Matthew, Randall, Keeley, all of their experiences. But Kerry had an experience too.
That's right. I mean, she will be there at the inquiry. She's going to be there every day. She wants to know, and she wants, at the very least, an acknowledgement that, one, they weren't given the warnings that they should have been. They weren't advised. And also, was it right for his body to be left there all that time? And I don't think you can blame her for wanting that.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. Up next, we explore what led the Train family to commit such a heinous crime. I want to backtrack a little bit because the deaths of Rachel, Matthew and Alan happened quite quickly, but this siege actually went on for many, many hours. How did the rest of the night unfold?
So we had that first stage, I guess. So we had the ambush, then there's the 16 police officers, the country coppers going in, extracting their colleagues. And basically then they were holding the situation a couple of hours because they had to wait for the specialist officers coming from Brisbane. There were 2 police choppers. By the time they arrived, they then moved in and with absolute precision, they had a plan. The helicopter, Polair up in the sky, they could see where Gareth, Nathaniel and Stacey Train were on the property, and they were relaying that to the officers on the ground.
PLI 1 is now back at the rear tray of the vehicle, and PLI 2 remains on the red side stairs. Yeah, a number of shots going off there.
That gunfire, though, went for about 5 hours, and I think in that time police were assessing the situation, figuring out how we're going to deal with this. But once they decided, okay, we're taking them down, they're not giving in, the 3 trains were killed within minutes. And that was it.
So basically they were trying to work out whether they could negotiate first and save their lives as well, and then they decided that that wasn't going to happen.
I can only assume that. And again, this really is still a story that's unfolding. That's the conclusion that you might draw, because once they decided this is the end for the trains, it was done in minutes.
I think we need to focus in on the trains a bit more. We haven't spoken about them. And I want to start with the overview because obviously there's so much to dig into. But they were teachers and they were also in a bit of a love triangle. Let's start there. Let's start with their lives on the surface before we dig in.
Yes, and they were some of the details that were coming out in the days following that just made what was already, a mind-blowing story even stranger. So Nathaniel and Stacey were married first. They had 2 children, Madeline and Aidan. But when they were toddlers, young, Nathaniel and Stacey split, and she then married Gareth, the older brother. Now, Gareth and Nathaniel had been raised, their family, their father was a Baptist minister. So they had been raised in a very Christian upbringing. Their father spoke after the event and said that he hadn't seen the boys since their mid-20s, and they were in their mid-40s when this all went down. So he had had nothing to do with them. And he talked about Gareth as always having been a difficult child, volatile, obsessed with guns. So from there, they lived their own lives. Nathaniel, he was a principal of a school. Stacey was a teacher at Tara, which is one of the local towns near Weambilla. So she was teaching in the area. But at that point, she was living with Gareth, the older brother. Nathaniel had moved down to Walgett in northern New South Wales, and he was teaching at a school there. And he had also taught up in North Queensland. And people who knew him as a principal, as a teacher, talked about a well-respected, caring educator who was very interested and concerned for his students, and Stacey as well. And Gareth, we know that he was a conspiracy theorist. He often had been. Madeline, who then was raised by Gareth and Stacey, who referred to Gary as dad, she spoke about him and said he would go down rabbit holes, but not to a point where she was really, really worried. But he did follow these theories and whatnot. But I think it was through COVID where a lot of people were affected badly. Now, Nathaniel had a heart attack and he also didn't want to be vaccinated. So he finished up his job in northern New South Wales and was very angry. And that seemed to the health issues and not wanting to get vaccinated, and it sent him down a rabbit hole.
Because that was a requirement of teachers, wasn't it? They had to be vaccinated to teach.
That's correct. You had to be vaccinated. So he started down this path. He fired off a lot of complaints to the education department about all sorts of things. And Stacey also lost her job because she wouldn't get vaccinated. Once he left the school, he then decided he wanted to come up to Queensland to see his kids. But of course, because he wasn't vaccinated and because during COVID, Queensland considered New South Wales a COVID hotspot, you weren't allowed to come into Queensland unless you had been vaccinated, and he wasn't vaccinated. So he, through a Gundawindi crossing, which again is sort of way out west, he broke through a barrier, illegally entered Queensland and made his way to Gareth and Stacey, where he was for about a year. And we know that police did look for him once before, about a year before the incident, and they didn't find him. No red flags were raised about that. But then for a year, the 3 of them lived in that 2-bedroom Queenslander, and hardly anyone saw them. I mean, you think Kerry lived across the road, and yes, it's not like a normal neighbourhood, but she only saw them a couple of times, maybe waved at them at the letterbox. And what happened was they found an online community that became their community. And that's when they just went down. There are terms like premillennialism, accelerationism. I don't know if you've heard of them.
What does that even mean?
So premillennialism, and this is in broad terms, they believe in the second coming of Christ,
okay,
and that he will come back and rule for 1,000 years. Accelerationism is the ideology that activists are encouraged to sow chaos and problems to accelerate society's demise because governments are so corrupt that they need to help destabilize everything to create chaos and accelerate the change that needs to happen. So they started going down some fairly dark pathways, and that's where police claim they met Donald Day Jr., this was then another facet of this story, which was also mind-blowing. So this happened then a year after the shooting. Queensland Police were in America with the FBI. They had been following leads, and they arrested a man called Donald Day Jr. in Arizona. And he has been charged with inciting the trains to behave the way they did.
How could he do that from the other side of the world?
They had an online relationship. They were sharing videos. They were commenting on videos. Stacey and Gareth, on the night of the shootings, after the initial ambush, they recorded a video. And at the very end of the video, they say, "Don, we'll see you later. We'll see you at home." And Stacey says, "Love you, Don."
Oh.
And everyone was like, "Don, what does that refer to? That's weird. What's that?" A year later, we finally found out. Don was Donald Day Jr. in America, Arizona, also a Christian extremist with more things to his credit, who has now been charged. He's facing 5 federal charges in the US. His case will happen later in the year. He's been charged with helping to lead the trains into this mindset where police officers, authority were considered devils, demons, that you had to fight for your rights with virtuous violence. That's what they called it.
So on that day of the shooting, from this online chat, can we ascertain that they wanted police to come to their property so that they could kill them?
This is one of the answers that we're hoping will finally come out at the inquest. They were set up, definitely, for an ambush. I mean, the property had weapons, they had camouflage spots, they had mirrors set up so that they could see what was going on. There were radios, there was a trapdoor in the house, there were thousands and thousands of rounds of ammunition on that property, high-powered rifles, semi-automatics, things that could fire rapidly. They were ready for Armageddon, let's say. Were they just waiting? Did they have an idea that it would at some point happen, that at some point someone would come looking for Nathaniel? We hope that gets answered, and I'm sure the families of all of those involved, that's what they want to know.
As a triplet, Matt was the older brother by just a few minutes, but this made him no less of a big brother to his siblings. He was also a protector, a leader, and a big brother to all those who knew him.
Rach was simply one of a kind. She could literally light up any room on the darkest of days with her beautiful, infectious smile and those pearly white teeth. She was the kindest and most positive person I know. She had the purest of souls and the warmest of hearts.
I want to talk a little bit more about Rachel and Matthew. They were given a memorial service. There were thousands of people there. The grief that was felt in those services and in the weeks afterwards, can you capture that for us? Because you covered it in detail on the news.
It's just the senselessness, I think, of these beautiful young people really at the cusp of adulthood and beginning this life. And they were both very well respected within the police force. Rachel described as, one of the police officers that the world needs now, and well loved by their families. Rachel's sister and her mother, they were kind of known as the McCrow girls, super close. Matthew was a triplet. His parents, he was coming home, as we said earlier, to spend Christmas with them in Brisbane and start his new path within Queensland Police. And I think it was also the fact that, it was the worst police shooting in Queensland. It was Australia's first Christian terror attack. People felt like this doesn't happen in Australia. And of course, you could see the grief of the families, of the police force, because as well, that is that thing of it was a routine call out. Every day, our police officers and emergency services go to routine call-outs, and much worse. But to think that their lives can be taken so quickly, so unexpectedly, it shocked everyone. I think we all felt it because we just felt the fragility of life.
What about Randall and Keely? they went through something horrific that day. I can only imagine mentally that must be a lot to get through, especially Keely, who was in that bush for 2 hours running for her life. Do we know much about what their lives have been like since?
For Keely, we know that they have asked, heading into the inquiry, if that 000 call, there's obviously a recording of that 000 call, if that can be her evidence, because to stand up in that courtroom and recount it is too traumatic for her. I think of Randall. He had one child and his second was due in weeks at the time of the incident. And we're hoping that he will talk at the inquiry. And I hope that he has been able to find some sense of normality. I don't know how you do, but hopefully he has.
Because one of your reporters, I think it must be Alex, who's been covering the story so closely, he saw the car that Randall was in, didn't he?
That's right. It had dozens and dozens of bullets. Randall had already been hit in the leg, managed to get into the car, and as he's driving out, they were just shooting up the car. So he was again hit by shrapnel and glass from the windscreens being smashed. I mean, despite all of that, physically he recovered quite quickly. I don't think those mental and emotional scars heal so quickly, though.
I want to bring Alan's widow in again because another thing she's been struggling with is the title of hero. It's one that's been given to Alan, but she doesn't agree with it.
No. And one of her quotes, and if I'm allowed to just use the F word this once in her context, she says, Alan Dare, the hero, he'd be up there laughing his f***ing ass off. You know, there are a couple of reasons why she doesn't want him remembered as a hero, because she wants him remembered for all the things that he was aside from that day. She doesn't want him to be defined by that day, that he was a handyman. He built all sorts of things. He loved his grandkids. He was a family man. He was her husband of nearly 26 years. That's what she wants him to be remembered for. And I think she also feels that title of hero, and people, you know, and we all did, from the Prime Minister down to people on the street, everyone called him a hero. She feels like, I don't know, people in a way took ownership of him as this hero, and that's not who she remembers. And she says there's no way he went out there thinking that he was going to stop some gunfight. He went out there just to investigate a fire because fires are dangerous in that area. He went out to protect her, not to be a hero in a broader sense of the community. And I think it just goes into her anger of why he was out there in the first place. And that because people think by calling him a hero, it will change the way she feels about that.
It's also really interesting to hear her story because as the media, not that you get carried away, but once a story is out there labelling Alan as hero, that is multiplied over and over and over again, and then that's the story it becomes.
Yes.
It's almost a good reminder to look beyond the headlines sometimes.
It's so true. And that's for us as well. And do you know, even that thing though, at the time, Alex and other reporters who were out there, you talk to people in Weambilla and they've said, Alan, he was just that kind of guy. He would give you the shirt off his back. And so that's what people were telling us as well. But then Gary again laughingly said, he wouldn't give you the shirt off his back. He only had 3 shirts. He's not giving away a shirt. And that's why I think as well, we are so interested from a podcast point of view and from a reporting point of view. Yes, we've got these 4 episodes that sort of tell the story as we know it now. But once we get into the inquest on the 29th of July, how much more is going to come out? How much of the story is going to change? That's going to be fascinating.
We've touched on some of the questions that the inquest is going to be looking into, but there were 9 areas that the inquest has laid out that they're going to delve into. We won't go into all 9, but what is the purpose, really? For those that aren't across inquest, like what's the top line? What are we trying to get? There's obviously no one's going to be behind bars.
No.
All 3 trains are deceased.
That's right.
So why do we do this?
We do it because they're trying to find whatever information they can so that this won't happen again. They're trying to give the families and the people who have been affected by it as much information as possible so that they can make sense of it, perhaps, so that they can understand it better. And it might, no one's bring them peace. I know that's an awful phrase, but it might give them a better understanding of how and why it happened. But we do need to know, could the New South Wales Police have told the Queensland Police anything different about Nathaniel Train when he crossed the border? That missing persons check was a call from New South Wales Police to Queensland Police. Can you go and check on this guy? Is there anything else that the Queensland police officers should have been told that day? That might come out. I think, we do often say we want to learn so that it never happens again. I think really what we want is it doesn't happen as often. And if it does happen again, we're better prepared. And part of that is one of the things that has already come out about it. It was the National Gun Register that has been talked about that has now been put in place, and that will be up and running within 4 years. And what that will be is a national database. Who owns what guns? Are there any sort of outstanding warrants? Are there any that their licenses have expired? Those sorts of things will be available to police officers right across Australia rather than each state having their own. So these sorts of things of, do we need to streamline some information that we share, police officers share, authorities share? And also the other thing is, what else do we need to know about this online radicalisation that's going on? How does ASIO or that security level deal with it, and how are they going to deal with it in the future? Because there's only going to be more of that, unfortunately.
I think that's the part that I find quite terrifying. The online communities, the amount of hate and vitriol and misinformation that is in those worlds. I mean, we've just seen it with this story. Teachers turned into killers.
Cop killers. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's a potential for that to be the next frontier of violence in our country?
Oh, I think that's what we're all frightened of. And I think we're lucky in Australia because we do have such strict gun control, the gun laws that we have, which of course came in after the awful Port Arthur massacre. Yes, that's one aspect of the guns being around, but we do need to deal with this online. I don't know how you do it. I mean, it's a very dark place. And I guess the authorities are doing the best they can to try to monitor it.
Thanks to Melissa for helping us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Liv Proud. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.